Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 2 of our complete practice question series for the DVA-C02 AWS Certified Developer Associate exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends, then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 2. Question number 44. Amazon S3 asynchronously invokes a Lambda function when images are uploaded under a source prefix. Images that exceed the function's processing time must be sent to a second Lambda function that performs a simpler resize. The developer wants the smallest amount of additional application code and infrastructure. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A, send failed invocation records to an Amazon SNS topic and subscribe the fallback Lambda function. Option B, configure the fallback Lambda function as the on-failure destination of the original Lambda function. Option C, send failed invocation records to an Amazon SQS and configure the fallback function with an SQS event source mapping. Option D, replace the S3 trigger with an event bridge triggered step functions workflow that implements the fallback path. The correct answer is B, configure the fallback Lambda function as the on-failure destination of the original Lambda function. Here is why. S3 invokes Lambda asynchronously, and an on-failure destination can route the failed invocation record directly to another Lambda function after retries are exhausted. Why are the other options not correct? A, SNS adds an intermediary topic and subscription. C, SQS adds a queue and event source mapping. D, step functions and event bridge require a larger workflow redesign. Exam tip. Lambda destinations provide low overhead success or failure routing for asynchronous invocations. Question number 45. A shopping application is moving to an auto-scaling group behind an application load balancer. Its current web server keeps user sessions in memory, and session growth causes high memory utilization. Transactional business data is stored in MySQL. Which additional change best improves scalability and performance? Option A, move session state to Amazon Elastic Cache for Memcached and move transactional data to Amazon RDS for MySQL. Option B, store session state on each EC2 instance's instance store and move business data to Amazon RDS for MySQL. Option C, store both session state and transactional records in Amazon Elastic Cache for Memcached. Option D, run MySQL on a single EC2 instance and store both sessions and transactional data in that database. The correct answer is A, move session state to Amazon Elastic Cache for Memcached and move transactional data to Amazon RDS for MySQL. Here is why. Externalizing session state removes memory pressure from individual web instances and allows any auto-scaling instance to serve a user, while RDS provides managed relational storage for transactions. Why are the other options not correct? B, instance store sessions remain tied to individual instances and disappear when instances terminate. C, Memcached is not the durable relational system of record for order data. D, a single EC2 database retains management overhead and does not address web tier session scalability as effectively. Exam tip. Keep auto-scaling web tiers stateless by moving sessions to a shared cache and durable application records to an appropriate database. Question number 46. An on-premises application produces logs that must be investigated together with logs from applications running on AWS. The developer wants the on-premises logs available centrally in Amazon CloudWatch logs. How should the developer implement this requirement? Option A, copy the log files to Amazon S3 and configure CloudWatch logs to read the objects. Option B, install an AWS SDK and rely on it to discover and upload operating system log files automatically. Option C, install and configure the CloudWatch agent on the on-premises server, using credentials that permit the required CloudWatch logs operations. Option D, copy the files to an EC2 instance and create a custom forwarding application on that Instance. The correct answer is C. Install and configure the CloudWatch agent on the on-premises server, using credentials that permit the required CloudWatch logs operations. Here is why. The CloudWatch agent can collect local log files from servers outside AWS and publish them to CloudWatch logs when valid AWS credentials and permissions are configured. Why are the other options not correct? A. CloudWatch logs does not automatically ingest arbitrary files stored in S3. B. Installing an SDK does not automatically discover and ship system or application logs. D. An EC2 forwarding server is an unnecessary custom intermediary. Exam tip. Use the CloudWatch agent to collect logs and metrics from both EC2 and on-premises servers. Question number 47. A checkout API submits orders to a Lambda function by using asynchronous invocation. Customers occasionally receive an accepted response, but an order is never completed. The function's ordinary application logs contain no corresponding failure details. What should the developer do to recover and troubleshoot these events? Option A. Disable API gateway caching for the post method. Option B. Search browser logs and manually resend each original HTTP request. Option C. Configure and inspect a dead letter queue for failed asynchronous Lambda events. Correct the failure and reprocess the retained events. Option D. Continue searching the function's normal CloudWatch logs for code exceptions. The correct answer is C. Configure and inspect a dead letter queue for failed asynchronous Lambda events, correct the failure, and reprocess the retained events. Here is why. Asynchronous invocation can accept an event before later processing fails. A configured dead letter queue retains events that remain unsuccessful after Lambda retries. Why are the other options not correct? A. Post caching is unrelated to downstream asynchronous processing failures. B. Manually replaying browser requests is unreliable and does not preserve failed events. D. The scenario states that ordinary function logs do not reveal the missing events. Exam tip. For asynchronous Lambda processing, retain exhausted failures in a DL queue or on failure destination so they can be investigated and replayed. Question number 48. An S3 bucket contains objects encrypted with an AWS KMS key. Several external AWS accounts are allowed to retrieve the objects. The bucket owner must centrally reject every GetObject request that does not use TLS. Which policy control enforces this requirement? Option A. Add a deny statement to the external roles identity policies when AWS Secure Transport is false. Option B. Add an allow statement to the bucket policy when AWS Secure Transport is false. Option C. Add a deny statement to the KMS key policy when AWS Secure Transport is false. Option D. Add a deny statement to the S3 bucket policy when AWS Secure Transport is false. The correct answer is D. Add a deny statement to the S3 bucket policy when AWS Secure Transport is false. Here is why. An explicit bucket policy denial using AWS Secure Transport equals false centrally blocks non-TLS S3 requests, including requests from otherwise authorized external principals. Why are the other options not correct? A. Policies in external accounts are not a centralized bucket owner enforcement control and may not cover every principal. B. Allowing requests when Secure Transport is false does the opposite of the requirement. C. A KMS key policy controls use of the key, not the transport requirement for S3 GetObject requests. Exam tip. Enforce HTTPS for S3 with an explicit bucket policy deny when AWS Secure Transport is false. Question number 49. Clients report that requests to a Lambda-backed API gateway REST API are timing out. The Lambda function's measured execution time is below its configured timeout. The developer needs CloudWatch metrics that distinguish total API processing time from time spent waiting. For the back-end integration, which two API gateway metrics should the developer compare? Choose 2. Option A, count. Option B, cache miss count. Option C, integration latency. Option D, latency. E, cache hit count. The correct answer is C, integration latency, D, latency. Here is why. Integration latency measures time from API gateway sending the request to the backend until the backend response is received. Latency measures the full API gateway request to response duration. Why are the other options not correct? A, count measures request volume, not elapsed time. B, cache miss count reports cache misses. E, cache hit count reports cache hits. Exam tip. Compare API gateway latency with integration latency to determine whether delay is inside the backend integration or elsewhere in API processing. The correct answer is A. Store each encrypted report in Amazon S3, provide an 8-hour pre-signed URL, and configure an S3 lifecycle expiration rule for reports older than 2 days. Here is why. S3 supports large encrypted objects, pre-signed URLs provide temporary customer-specific access, and lifecycle expiration removes old reports without custom cleanup code. Why are the other options not correct? B. DynamoDB items have a 400 kilobytes maximum size, so reports larger than 1 megabytes cannot be stored as single items. C. RDS plus a scheduled cleanup function adds database and operational overhead. D. Email attachment delivery is unsuitable for large reports and does not provide the required 8-hour controlled URL. Exam tip. Use S3 pre-signed URLs for temporary object access and lifecycle rules for automatic retention management. Question number 51. A build team must store fixed software license strings securely. Automation running on Amazon EC2 and AWS CloudFormation templates must retrieve the values. The keys do not need managed rotation, and cost should be minimized. Which service should the team use? Option A, CloudFormation parameters with the noEcho attribute. Option B, AWS Secrets Manager secrets. Option C, AWS Systems Manager parameter store secure string parameters. Option D, encrypted text files in Amazon S3. The correct answer is C. AWS Systems Manager parameter store secure string parameters. Here is why. Secure string parameters provide encrypted centralized values that EC2 automation and CloudFormation dynamic references can retrieve, without paying for managed secret rotation that is not required. Why are the other options not correct? A. noEcho masks a parameter in displays but is not a centralized reusable secret store. B. Secrets Manager supports rotation but adds cost for a fixed value that does not require rotation. D. Encrypted S3 objects require custom retrieval and parsing logic. Exam tip. Use parameter store secure string for encrypted configuration. Choose Secrets Manager when managed secret rotation is a decisive requirement. Question number 52. A development group is assembling an AWS code pipeline workflow and needs an AWS managed Git repository in which to keep the application's source code. Which service provides this capability? Option A. AWS Code Artifact. Option B. AWS Code Commit. Option C. AWS Code Deploy. Option D. Amazon Code Guru. The correct answer is B. AWS Code Commit. Here is why. Code Commit is AWS's managed source control service for privately hosting Git repositories that can be used as a code pipeline source. Why are the other options not correct? A. Code Artifact stores software packages, not Git source repositories. C. Code Deploy deploys application revisions to supported compute targets. D. Code Guru provides code analysis and profiling capabilities. Exam tip. Code Commit stores Git source, Code Artifact stores packages, Code Build builds, and Code Deploy deploys. Question number 53. During one invocation, a Lambda function repeatedly creates and modifies Scratch files smaller than 10 megabytes. The files have no value after the invocation completes and do not need durable storage. Where should the function write the files? Option A. Amazon S3. Option B. The function execution environments/TMP directory. Option C. An Amazon EFS file system. Option D. An Amazon EBS volume. The correct answer is B. The function execution environments/TMP directory. Here is why. Lambda provides writable ephemeral storage in /TMP for temporary files needed during execution, and no durable service is required for disposable Scratch data. Why are the other options not correct? A. S3 is durable object storage and adds network calls. C. EFS is persistent shared file storage and requires VPC configuration. D. EBS volumes cannot be directly attached to Lambda execution environments. Exam tip. Use /TMP for Lambda Scratch data. Use S3 or EFS only when data must persist or be shared. Question number 54. Two Python Lambda functions use the same large scientific library, including the dependency separately in both zip deployment packages is causing package size pressure. The developer wants to share the dependency without combining the functions or adding a runtime download process. What is the lowest overhead solution? Option A. Package the common library in a Lambda layer and attach the layer to both functions. Option B. Merge both handlers into one Lambda function and deploy one zip archive. Option C. Upload the library to Amazon S3 and have each invocation import it from an object URL. Option D. Include a separate copy of the library in each function's deployment archive. The correct answer is A. Package the common library in a Lambda layer and attach the layer to both functions. Here is why. A Lambda layer packages shared dependencies separately so multiple functions can reuse one version without embedding duplicate copies in each deployment archive. Why are the other options not correct? B. Combining unrelated handlers reduces separation of concerns and is unnecessary. C. Downloading code at runtime adds latency, complexity, and availability dependencies. D. Duplicate copies do not reduce package size pressure. Exam tip. Lambda layers are designed for reusable libraries, custom runtimes, and shared dependencies. Question number 55. A Lambda function must run when items are inserted, modified, or removed from a DynamoDB table. The implementation should process the table's item-level change records. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Invoke the function from a scheduled event bridge rule that scans the table. Option B. Attach an independent Kinesis data stream to the table and trigger Lambda from that stream. Option C. Enable DynamoDB streams and create a Lambda event source mapping for the stream. Option D. Configure Amazon Data Firehose with the Lambda function as the delivery destination. The correct answer is C. Enable DynamoDB streams and create a Lambda event source mapping for the stream. Here is why. DynamoDB streams captures item-level insert, modify, and remove records, and Lambda can pull the stream through an event source mapping. Why are the other options not correct? A. Scheduled scans are not event-driven and do not provide the native change records. B. An independent Kinesis stream is not automatically populated with DynamoDB changes. D. Data Firehose is a delivery service and does not use Lambda as its final destination. Exam tip. Use DynamoDB streams with a Lambda event source mapping to react to table changes. Question number 56. A Lambda function connects to an Amazon RDS for my SQL database. Database credentials are currently stored in an S3 object. The new solution must encrypt the credentials, integrate with the database and Lambda, and rotate the credentials automatically with minimal custom management. Which solution should the developer use? Option A. Put the encrypted credentials in Lambda environment variables and build a scheduled rotation function that updates both the database and function configuration. Option B. Store the credentials as an Amazon RDS database secret in AWS Secrets Manager, enable managed rotation, and retrieve the secret from the Lambda function. Option C. Store the credentials in parameter store secure string parameters and enable automatic database credential rotation on the parameters. Option D. Encrypt the credentials in DynamoDB and create a scheduled Lambda function that rotates and synchronizes the values. The correct answer is B. Store the credentials as an Amazon RDS database secret in AWS Secrets Manager, enable managed rotation, and retrieve the secret from the Lambda function. Here is why. Secrets Manager securely stores and encrypts database credentials and provides managed rotation integration for supported RDS databases, minimizing custom code. Why are the other options not correct? A. Custom rotation through environment variables requires substantial code and coordination. C. Parameter store does not provide the described managed automatic RDS credential rotation. D. DynamoDB and a custom rotation function add storage, scheduling, and synchronization logic. Exam tip. When automatic database secret rotation is required, Secrets Manager is usually the direct managed solution. Question number 57. A developer has written the following IAM policy to provide access to an Amazon S3 bucket. Version, October 17, 2012. Statement. Effect, allow. Action. S3, get object. S3, put object. Resource, NM, WS, S3, DOC example bucket / asterisk. Effect, deny. Action, 33. Resource, ARN AWS, S3, DOC example bucket / secrets asterisk. Which access does the policy allow regarding the S3, get object and S3, put object actions? Option A, access on all buckets except the DOC example bucket. Option B, access on all buckets that start with DOC example bucket except the DOC example bucket / secrets bucket. Option C, access on all objects in the DOC example bucket along with access to all S3 actions for objects in the DOC example bucket that start with secrets. Option D, access on all objects in the DOC example bucket except on objects that start with secrets. The correct answer is D, access on all objects in the DOC example bucket except on objects that start with secrets. Here is why. The first statement permits S3, get object and S3, put object for every object in the bucket. The second statement explicitly denies every S3 action for object keys matching secrets star. An explicit deny always overrides an allow. Why are the other options not correct? A. The policy applies only to objects in DOC example bucket, not to every other bucket. B. Secrets is an object key prefix, not a separate S3 bucket. C. The second statement is an explicit deny, not an additional permission granting all S3 actions. Exam tip. In IAM evaluation, An explicit deny overrides every applicable allow. Also distinguish a bucket ARN from an object ARN containing a prefix. Question number 58. A streaming ingestion service receives records containing pattern-based personal identifiers. The records must be redacted before the delivery stream writes them to an S3 bucket. Which implementation meets the requirement? Option A, configure an EC2 instance as the delivery stream destination, redact the records on the instance, and then copy them to Amazon S3. Option B, enable Amazon Data Firehose record transformation with an AWS Lambda function that redacts the identifiers, and use Amazon S3 as the destination. Option C, deliver the records to Amazon Open Search Service, perform search and replace operations, and export the results to S3. Option D, configure an AWS Step Functions workflow as the direct delivery stream destination and write the final workflow output to S3. The correct answer is B, enable Amazon Data Firehose record transformation with an AWS Lambda function that redacts the identifiers, and use Amazon S3 as the destination. Here is why. Data Firehose can invoke Lambda to transform incoming records before delivering the transformed output to an S3 destination. Why are the other options not correct? A. EC2 is not the direct Firehose destination described in Ad Server Management. C. OpenSearch is not required for inline redaction and export adds unnecessary stages. D. Step Functions is not a direct Firehose delivery destination for this transformation pattern. Exam tip. Use a Firehose Lambda transformation for record-level enrichment, conversion, or redaction before delivery. Question number 59. An S3 event invokes a Lambda function that extracts document metadata and writes it to DynamoDB. The developer needs to inspect messages written by the function code to diagnose unexpected behavior. Where are these runtime logs available by default? Option A, AWS CloudTrail. Option B, Amazon CloudWatch Logs. Option C, Amazon S3. Option D, Amazon DynamoDB. The correct answer is B, Amazon CloudWatch Logs. Here is why. Lambda sends messages written through supported runtime logging methods or standard output to CloudWatch Logs by default when the execution role has logging permissions. Why are the other options not correct? A. CloudTrail records AWS API activity, not ordinary function code log messages. C. S3 stores the source objects but is not Lambda's default runtime log destination. D. DynamoDB stores application metadata in this design, not function logs. Exam tip. Use CloudWatch Logs for Lambda runtime messages and CloudTrail for AWS API audit history. Question number 60. A Lambda event source mapping processes records from a Kinesis data stream. The iterator age metric is steadily rising, and each invocation takes longer than expected. The developer must increase parallel stream capacity and give each invocation more compute power. Which two actions should the developer take? Choose two. Option A, reduce the number of Kinesis shards. Option B, increase the memory allocated to the Lambda function. Option C, increase the Lambda function timeout. Option D, increase the number of shards in the Kinesis data stream. E, decrease the Lambda function timeout. The correct answer is B, increase the memory allocated to the Lambda function. D, increase the number of shards in the Kinesis data stream. Here is why. More Lambda memory provides proportionally more CPU and can reduce invocation duration. More Kinesis shards allow more batches to be processed concurrently and can reduce iterator age. Why are the other options not correct? A, fewer shards reduce available stream parallelism. C, a longer timeout permits longer execution but does not make processing faster. E, a shorter timeout can create failures and retries without improving throughput. Exam tip. Rising Kinesis iterator age indicates processing lag, improve per invocation performance, and increase stream parallelism when appropriate. Question number 61. A claims processing application runs on Amazon EC2 and publishes distributed traces to AWS X-ray. Requests can contain patient identifiers, and compliance rules require the application to prevent those identifiers from being included in any trace data that leaves the instances. Which instrumentation approach gives the developer the required control? Option A, instrument the application automatically by using AWS distro for OpenTelemetry. Option B, instrument the application code manually with the AWS X-ray SDK and add only approved fields to segments and subsegments. Option C, use Amazon DVA-C to redact trace data after a Lambda function retrieves it. Option D, install an X-ray auto instrumentation agent and accept its default captured fields. The correct answer is B, instrument the application code manually with the AWS X-ray SDK and add only approved fields to segments and subsegments. Here is why. Manual instrumentation lets the application control exactly which request attributes are added to X-ray trace documents, preventing PII from being emitted. Why are the other options not correct? A. Auto instrumentation still exports collected telemetry and does not guarantee application-specific PII exclusion. C. DVA-C discovers sensitive data in S3, it is not an inline X-ray trace sanitizer. D. Auto instrumentation provides less field-level control than deliberate application instrumentation. Exam tip. Never place secrets or PII in trace annotations or metadata. Sanitize data before telemetry leaves the application. Question number 62. A delivery platform builds container images in an AWS code pipeline workflow, stores them in Amazon ECR, and deploys them to Amazon EKS. Runtime security tests currently occur only after deployment. The team wants the pipeline to inspect each completed image and stop vulnerable images before the deployment action. Which solution provides the most operationally efficient control? Option A. Add a stage immediately after source retrieval that scans only the application source and fails when findings are detected. Option B. Require developers to run a local Docker scan and enforce the process with a pre-commit hook. Option C. Add a post-build code pipeline stage, enable ECR basic scanning on image push, and use a Lambda action to evaluate the scan findings and fail the pipeline when necessary. Option D. Add the scan-checking Lambda action inside the deployment stage immediately before the Amazon EKS deployment action. The correct answer is C. Add a post-build code pipeline stage, enable ECR basic scanning on image push, and use a Lambda action to evaluate the scan findings and fail the pipeline when necessary. Here is why. The completed image is scanned in ECR after it is pushed, and a dedicated pre-deployment gate can stop the pipeline based on the image findings. Why are the other options not correct? A. Source scanning does not analyze vulnerabilities in the built container image. B. A local voluntary workflow is difficult to govern and is outside the centralized pipeline. D. Placing the check in the deployment stage is less clearly separated and reusable than a dedicated analysis stage after the build. Exam tip. Scan the built artifact and place the vulnerability gate before deployment, not only after the workload is running. Question number 63. A CloudFront distribution serves files from a private Amazon S3 origin through an origin access identity. The default cache behavior requires signed cookies because most objects contain customer documents. A public sign-in page is stored under /signin/index.html, but users receive HTTP 403 before they can authenticate. How should the developer expose only the sign-in page while keeping all other content restricted? Option A. Make the S3 sign-in object public and redirect unauthorized viewers directly to its S3 URL with a CloudFront function. Option B, configure an origin failover pair and make the failover origin unrestricted only for the sign-in object. Option C, replace the default behavior with an unrestricted /signin/index.html behavior and add a second restricted behavior whose path pattern is star. Option D, add a higher priority cache behavior for /signin/index.html that uses the same S3 origin and does not require signed cookies. Leave the restricted default behavior intact. The correct answer is D. Add a higher priority cache behavior for /signin/index.html that uses the same S3 origin and does not require signed cookies. Leave the restricted default behavior intact. Here is why. CloudFront evaluates the specific path behavior before the default behavior, allowing public access only to the sign-in page while signed cookies remain required for all other paths. Why are the other options not correct? A direct public S3 URL bypasses the private origin access design. B. Origin failover selects an origin after an error, it does not define viewer authorization by path. C. The default behavior cannot be assigned a custom path pattern, and asterisk would also take precedence incorrectly. Exam tip. Use a specific CloudFront cache behavior for public paths and retain a restricted default behavior for private content. Question number 64. An AWS Amplify hosting application is deployed automatically from a Git repository. The team wants Cypress end-to-end tests to execute during each build so that a failed test can prevent a defective release. Where should the developer configure this testing workflow? Option A. Add a test phase and the required commands to the application's amplify.yml build specification. Option B. Add a test section to the generated AWS exports.js configuration file. Option C. Run Amplify add test and rely on the Amplify CLI to create the hosting test workflow. Option D. Upload unit tests to the Amplify backend by running Amplify push. The correct answer is A. Add a test phase and the required commands to the application's amplify.yml build specification. Here is why. Amplify hosting runs supported end-to-end tests from the test phase of its build specification and can fail the build before deployment. Why are the other options not correct? B. AWS exports.js contains generated front-end configuration, not build phases. C. Amplify add test is not the mechanism for configuring hosting E2E build tests. D. Amplify push provisions backend resources and does not deploy unit tests as a test stage. Exam tip. Configure Amplify hosting build, frontend, backend, and test commands in amplify.yml. Question number 65. An elastic beanstalk environment normally runs 5 EC2 instances. The application must retain at least 4 available instances during a deployment. The current all-at-once policy makes the entire environment unavailable, and the company wants the least costly deployment change. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Use a rolling policy with a batch size of 2 instances. Option B. Increase the environment's steady-state desired capacity to 6 instances and keep the all-at-once policy. Option C. Use traffic splitting and evaluate the new version for 1 hour. Option D. Use rolling with additional batch and set the batch size to 1 instance. The correct answer is D. Use rolling with additional batch and set the batch size to 1 instance. Here is why. Elastic Beanstalk launches 1 temporary instance before updating a 1-instance batch, preserving the required capacity with only temporary extra cost. Why are the other options not correct? A. Updating 2 of 5 instances leaves only 3 serving instances. B. All at once still takes the whole environment out of service during deployment. C. Traffic splitting creates a parallel deployment fleet and costs more than 1 temporary additional instance. Exam tip. Rolling with additional batch preserves full capacity by temporarily adding a batch during deployment. Question number 66. A development group repeatedly tests several Lambda functions with the same saved JSON. Events. Every IAM user in the group must be able to view and update the centrally stored test events. Which configuration satisfies the requirement with the least custom storage? Option A, save each event as a private Lambda console test event. Option B, store the event documents in DynamoDB and grant the group table access. Option C, create the Lambda test events and set their event sharing setting to shareable. Option D, store the event documents in Amazon S3 and grant every developer bucket permissions. The correct answer is C, create the Lambda test events and set their event sharing setting to shareable. Here is why. Shareable Lambda test events are centrally available to users with the required function and test event permissions and can be maintained by the development team. Why are the other options not correct? A. Private test events are available only to their creator. B. DynamoDB adds an unnecessary custom event repository. D. S3 can store JSON but requires custom retrieval and editing instead of Lambda's native test event feature. Exam tip. Use shareable for Team Lambda test events and private for events that only one developer should access. Question number 67. A developer uses AWS App Config feature flags to test two variants of a new checkout experience. The developer needs one named tester to always receive variant A while other users continue to follow the normal variant allocation rules. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A, set variant A as the default for every application user. Option B, create a targeting rule that matches the tester's user ID and returns variant A. Option C, change the deployment strategy so that variant B receives 0% globally. Option D, create a separate app config application named after the tester. The correct answer is B, create a targeting rule that matches the tester's user ID and returns variant A. Here is why. A context-based targeting rule overrides normal variant allocation for the matching tester while leaving other users on the standard evaluation rules. Why are the other options not correct? A. It changes the experience for every user. C. It disables a variant globally instead of targeting one tester. D. A separate application is unnecessary and does not implement per user evaluation. Exam tip. Use feature flag targeting rules when one context must receive a fixed variant. Question number 68. An existing DynamoDB table uses asset ID as its partition key and supplier ID as its sort key. Application requests increasingly need to retrieve records by category and subtype. The table must remain available while the new access pattern is added. Which change enables efficient query operations for this access pattern? Option A. Add a local secondary index that uses category as its partition key and subtype as its sort key. Option B. Add a global secondary index that uses category as its partition key and subtype as its sort key. Option C. Replace the query operations with scan operations filtered by category and subtype. Option D. Recreate the table and define a local secondary index whose partition key is category. The correct answer is B. Add a global secondary index that uses category as its partition key and subtype as its sort key. Here is why. A GSI can be added to an existing table and can use a partition key that is different from the table's partition key, enabling efficient queries by category and subtype. Why are the other options not correct? A. An LSI must use the same partition key as the base table. C. Scan reads unrelated items and is less efficient than querying an index. D. Recreating the table is unnecessary, and the proposed LSI partition key is invalid. Exam tip. Use a GSI for a new access pattern with a different partition key. An LSI shares the table partition key. Question number 69. An Amazon RDS database is deployed in a private subnet of a custom VPC. A Lambda function. that was configured in the default VPC cannot connect to the database endpoint. Which change establishes the required private connectivity? Option A, attach an IAM policy that grants the function permission to use Amazon RDS APIs. Option B, allow every port from the entire VPC CIDR range in the database security group. Option C, configure the Lambda function to use subnets in the database VPC and permit the database port from the function's security group in the RDS security group. Option D, create a security group for the function in the default VPC and reference that group from the database security group. The correct answer is C. Configure the Lambda function to use subnets in the database VPC and permit the database port from the function's security group in the RDS security group. Here is why. VPC attachment creates Lambda network interfaces in the database VPC, and the security group reference permits private traffic to the RDS endpoint. Why are the other options not correct? A. IAM authorization does not create network connectivity to a private database. B. Opening all ports to an entire CIDR is excessive and does not fix the function's placement in another VPC. D. Security groups cannot be referenced across unrelated VPCs without supported connectivity and configuration. Exam tip. Private RDS access from Lambda requires VPC subnet configuration and a database security group rule. Question number 70. An EC2 hosted service already writes application logs to CloudWatch logs. A production failure is represented by the literal string payment_decrypt_failure. The team needs an SNS notification as soon as at least one matching log event is ingested, without running custom polling code. Which implementation has the least operational overhead? Option A, create a CloudWatch logs metric filter for payment_decrypt_failure, alarm when the derived metric is at least 1, and send the alarm notification to an SNS topic. Option B, run a scheduled Lambda function every 5 minutes to search the log group and publish matching results to SNS. Option C, publish a custom application metric and create an alarm in AWS CloudTrail. Option D, configure the CloudWatch agent itself to recognize the text and publish directly to SNS. The correct answer is A. Create a CloudWatch logs metric filter for payment_decrypt_failure, alarm when the derived metric is at least 1, and send the alarm notification to an SNS topic. Here is why. A metric filter converts matching log events into a CloudWatch metric, and the alarm can notify SNS as soon as the threshold is reached. Why are the other options not correct? B. Scheduled log polling introduces code, delay, and operational overhead. C. CloudTrail alarms are not used for application custom metrics. D. The agent ships logs and metrics but does not directly implement this log pattern SNS workflow. Exam tip. For alerting on a known log pattern, use a metric filter, CloudWatch alarm, and SNS notification. Question number 71. A Lambda function consumes numeric SQS messages and updates a rolling average stored outside the execution environment. Concurrent invocations sometimes raid and update the state at the same time, producing incorrect results. Which solution preserves the rolling state and prevents concurrent calculations? Option A, set provisioned concurrency to 1 and store the average in elastic cache. Option B, save historical values in a Lambda layer and reload them during initialization. Option C, store prior values in elastic cache but leave function concurrency unrestricted. Option D, store the rolling state in elastic cache and set the function's reserved concurrency to 1. The correct answer is D, store the rolling state in elastic cache and set the function's reserved concurrency to 1. Here is why. Elastic cache preserves state outside ephemeral Lambda environments, and reserved concurrency of 1 serializes invocations so updates cannot race. Why are the other options not correct? A. Provisioned concurrency keeps environments initialized but does not cap concurrent invocations at 1. B. Lambda layers are immutable deployment packages, not writable runtime state. C. External storage alone does not prevent concurrent read-modify-write races. Exam tip. Reserved concurrency limits parallel execution. Provisioned concurrency reduces cold starts. Question number 72. A developer is writing unit tests for a new application that will be deployed on AWS. The developer wants to validate all pull requests with unit tests and merge the code with the main branch only when all tests pass. The developer stores the code in AWS code commit and sets up AWS code build to run the unit tests. The developer creates an AWS Lambda function to start the code build task. The developer needs to identify the code commit events in an Amazon Event Bridge event that can invoke the Lambda function when a pull request is created or updated. Which code commit event will meet these requirements? AWS.CodeCommit. Source. Detail. Pull request merge status updated. Event. Source. AWS.CodeAkami. TC. Col. Detail. Pull request approval rule created. Event. Source. AWS.CodeCommit. Detail. Event. Pull request source branch updated. Pull request created. Source. AWS.CodeCommit. Detail. Event. Pull request updated. Pull request source branch created. The correct answer is C. Use the pull request source branch updated and pull request created code commit events. Here is why. Pull request created runs the unit test workflow when a new pull request is opened. Pull request source branch updated runs it again when new commits update the pull request source branch. Code commit publishes both as pull request state change events to Event Bridge. Why are the other options not correct? A. Pull request merge status updated relates to changes in merge eligibility or merge status, not every pull request creation or code update. B. Pull request approval rule created occurs when an approval rule is added. It does not represent a new or updated pull request. D. Pull request updated and pull request source branch created are not the correct code commit event names for this workflow. Exam tip. To test every pull request revision, match both pull request created and pull request source branch updated in the Event Bridge event pattern. Question number 73. A data processing application runs on EC2 instances managed by Elastic Beanstalk. During busy periods, performance falls, but the environment has no memory utilization metric. Because EC2 does not publish guest operating system memory by default. What should the developer configure to collect the missing metric? Option A. Create a CloudWatch dashboard and select the existing EC2 memory metric. Option B. Install and configure the CloudWatch agent to publish memory utilization from the instances. Option C. Enable log delivery to CloudWatch logs over TCP port 443. Option D. Add an empty.eb extensions directory so Elastic Beanstalk begins publishing memory usage. The correct answer is B. Install and configure the CloudWatch agent to publish memory utilization from the instances. Here is why. The CloudWatch agent collects guest operating system metrics such as memory usage that are not included in standard EC2 metrics. Why are the other options not correct? A. A dashboard visualizes metrics but does not collect a missing metric. C. Shipping logs does not publish memory utilization. D. The directory alone performs no monitoring configuration. Exam tip. Install the CloudWatch agent for memory, disk, and other operating system metrics that EC2 does not publish by default. Question number 74. A serverless stack is defined with AWS CDK and contains several Lambda constructs. The developer has both the CDK CLI and AWS SAM CLI installed and wants to invoke one function locally without deploying the stack. Which command sequence should the developer use? Option A. Run CDK synth, then run SAM local invoke with the function construct identifier and The synthesized CloudFormation template path. Option B, run CDK synth, then run SAM local start lambda with only the function construct identifier. Option C, run SAM package and SAM deploy, then create a console test event. Option D, run CDK deploy, then invoke the deployed function from the Lambda console. The correct answer is a run CDK synth, then run SAM local invoke with the function construct identifier and the synthesized CloudFormation template path. Here is why. CDK synthesis creates the CloudFormation template that SAM CLI can interpret, and SAM local invoke performs a one-time local Lambda invocation. Why are the other options not correct? B. SAM local start lambda starts a local endpoint rather than directly invoking the specified function as requested. C. Packaging and deployment are not needed for local testing. D. CDK deploy performs a cloud deployment, not a local test. Exam tip. Synthesize CDK first, then pass the generated template to SAM CLI for local serverless testing. Question number 75. An application already knows the complete primary keys for several DynamoDB items. It needs to retrieve those specific items in one request without reading unrelated table records. Which DynamoDB operation should the application call? Option A is scan. Option B, query. Option C, batch get item. Option D, get item. The correct answer is C, batch get item. Here is why. Batch get item retrieves multiple items by their complete primary keys in one API request without scanning unrelated records. Why are the other options not correct? A. Scan examines table or index items and has greater read impact. B. Query requires a partition key value and returns items in that key collection. D. Get item retrieves only one item per call. Exam tip. Use batch get item for multiple known keys and query for multiple items that share an index partition key. Question number 76. When a product image is uploaded to an S3 bucket, one subscriber must invoke a Lambda thumbnail generator and another subscriber must send an email. Both consumers need their own copy of the upload notification. Which design meets these requirements? Option A, send the S3 event to an SQS queue, configure Lambda to consume the queue, and create an email subscription on the queue. Option B, send the S3 event to an SNS topic, subscribe the Lambda function, and add an email subscription to the same topic. Option C, send the event to an SNS topic, subscribe Lambda and an SQS queue, and configure email delivery from the SQS queue. Option D, route the event to two SQS queues through EventBridge and create an email subscription on one queue. The correct answer is B, send the S3 event to an SNS topic, subscribe the Lambda function, and add an email subscription to the same topic. Here is why. SNS fanout delivers a separate copy of each S3 notification to both the Lambda subscription and the email subscription. Why are the other options not correct? A. SQS queues are consumed by applications and do not support direct email subscriptions. C. The additional queue is unnecessary, and email still cannot subscribe to SQS. D. The design adds EventBridge and queues while still proposing unsupported SQS email delivery. Exam tip. Use SNS when one event must fan out to multiple independent subscribers, including Lambda and email. Question number 77. A Lambda function transforms JSON objects uploaded to Amazon S3 and immediately writes the results to DynamoDB. Large bursts cause write throttling because transformed records reach the table too quickly. The developer wants to smooth the write rate and decouple transformation from persistence. Which change best meets the requirement? Option A, enable provisioned concurrency on an alias of the existing function. Option B, write unprocessed records to DynamoDB first and use DynamoDB streams to transform them afterward. Option C, enable DynamoDB auto-scaling and monitor consumed read and write capacity. Option D, split the workflow into a transformation function and a database writer function, and place an SQS queue between them. The correct answer is D, split the workflow into a transformation function and a database writer function, and place an SQS queue between them. Here is why. SQS buffers traffic bursts and lets the writer consume records at a controlled rate, decoupling transformation throughput from DynamoDB write throughput. Why are the other options not correct? A. Provisioned concurrency affects Lambda startup capacity, not DynamoDB write smoothing. B. It writes to the throttled table before transformation and does not buffer initial writes. C. Auto-scaling can help sustain demand but may react too slowly to sudden bursts and does not decouple producers. Exam tip. Use SQS as a buffer when bursty producers can overwhelm a downstream service. Question number 78. A consumer application needs a managed user directory that supports user registration, sign-in, and federation with social identity providers such as Google and Facebook. Which AWS service should the developer configure? Option A. An Amazon Cognito user pool. Option B. An Amazon Cognito identity pool. Option C. An IAM role. Option D. A AWS directory service. The correct answer is A. An Amazon Cognito user pool. Here is why. A user pool provides application sign-up, sign-in, a managed user directory, and federation with supported social identity providers. Why are the other options not correct? B. An identity pool primarily exchanges authenticated or guest identities for temporary AWS credentials. C. An IAM role is not an application user directory or registration service. D. Directory service is intended for directory workloads such as Microsoft Active Directory integration. Exam tip. User pools authenticate application users, identity pools vend temporary AWS credentials. Question number 79. A browser application is delivered through CloudFront and currently contains long-term role credentials in a JavaScript configuration file so that front-end code can call AWS STS. The developer must remove the embedded credentials and move the AWS SDK calls to an edge compute environment that can use an IAM execution role. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Use a CloudFront function, granted STS permissions through an execution role, and move the SDK calls into the function. Option B. Put the existing credentials inside a CloudFront function and move the SDK calls into that function. Option C. Use a viewer request lambda at edge function, grant its execution role the required STS permissions, and move the SDK calls into the function. Option D. Put the existing credentials inside a viewer request lambda at edge function and move the SDK calls into that function. The correct answer is C. Use a viewer request lambda at edge function, grant its execution role the required STS permissions, and move the SDK calls into the function. Here is why. Lambda at edge uses an IAM execution role and can call permitted AWS services, removing long-term credentials and AWS SDK logic from browser-delivered code. Why are the other options not correct? A. CloudFront functions have a restricted runtime and no general network access for STS SDK calls. B. It both uses the unsuitable runtime and continues embedding credentials. D. Moving plaintext credentials into Lambda at edge still hardcodes secrets instead of using the execution role. Exam tip. Server-side or edge Lambda code should use its execution role, never ship long-term AWS credentials to browser code. You have completed Part 2 of the DVA-C02 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.